I didn't beg when he decided to ruin me, and that was the first thing that made him hesitate. The order came at 9:17 p.m., quiet and precise, like everything Adrian Volkov did, no shouting, no threats, just a single sentence spoken into a phone that probably cost more than my entire apartment, and yet somehow it carried enough weight to erase a person from a city map without leaving a trace, and that person was supposed to be me. I was standing behind the reception desk when it happened, pretending to organize paperwork that didn't need organizing, my fingers moving out of habit while my mind stayed perfectly still, because stillness was the only thing I had learned to control. People think fear looks loud, like raised voices or shaking hands, but real fear is quieter than that. It sits in your chest and slows everything down until the world feels like it's moving through water, and that's exactly how it felt when I saw him glance in my direction, just once, just long enough for the decision to land. Adrian didn't look angry, didn't look cruel, didn't look anything at all. And that was the part that made it worse, because men who show emotion can be reasoned with, but men like him, they operate on something colder, something final. I had known this day might come, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I existed in a space where being invisible was the only protection, and the moment someone powerful noticed you, really noticed you, your life stopped belonging to you. The office around me kept moving, heels clicking on marble floors, quiet conversations about deals and deadlines, the hum of expensive air conditioning set to a perfect 72 degrees, everything normal, everything untouched, like the world had already decided I didn't matter enough to pause for. I picked up a folder, set it down, adjusted a pen that was already straight, small movements to keep my hands from betraying me, because the truth was I had been preparing for this long before he ever spoke that sentence, long before he ever learned my name, Adrian. Turned away after giving the order, already done with me, already moving on to something bigger, something worth his time. And for a moment, just a moment, I almost smiled, not because I was safe, but because he still didn't understand. He didn't see the hours I spent after my shift ended, didn't see the places I went when no one was watching, didn't see the choices I made that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a promise I had never broken. The elevator doors opened across the lobby, soft chime, polished steel reflecting a version of me that looked calm, composed, untouched, and I walked toward it at the same steady pace I always used, not too fast, not too slow, because running would mean fear and fear would mean guilt, and I wasn't guilty, not of what he thought, not of anything he could understand. As the doors closed, sealing me inside that quiet box of mirrors and soft lighting, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and for the first time that night, my hand stilled completely, not because I was giving up, but because I knew something he didn't, something he wouldn't discover until it was too late to undo what he had started. He thought he was removing a problem, but the truth was, I had never been the problem, and the moment he found out what I had been doing in secret, the moment he connected the pieces he hadn't even noticed were missing, that would be the moment everything changed, not just for me, but for him too. I did not go home that night, not because I was afraid of what he might do next, but because there were things that needed to be finished before his decision could reach me. The elevator descended in silence, each floor lighting up in a slow countdown that felt almost deliberate, like time itself was giving me one last chance to reconsider, but I had already made my choices long before Adrian Volkov ever noticed me. The lobby doors opened to the cool night air, the city stretching out in front of me under a sky that never fully went dark, streetlights reflecting off polished sidewalks, taxis passing in a steady rhythm, life continuing exactly as it always did, unaware that someone had just signed away mine. I walked 3 blocks east, then another 2 north, keeping the same pace, the same posture, because patterns mattered and I could not afford to break mine now, not when everything depended on it. The building I entered did not have a doorman or marble floors or anything that suggested importance, just a narrow hallway, flickering lights, and a security camera that had not worked in years, which was exactly why I chose it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, and my footsteps softened against worn carpet as I moved toward the back office, the one place in the city that still felt untouched by him. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me, not locking it this time, because locks were for people who believed they could keep danger out, and I knew better than that. The desk looked the same as I had left it, folders stacked neatly, a laptop powered down, a small lamp casting a circle of warm light that made the rest of the room disappear into shadow, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the quiet settle around me, letting the weight of what was coming press into my chest without resistance. Then I moved, not rushed, not panicked, just deliberate, opening the top drawer and pulling out the envelope I had prepared weeks ago, maybe months. Time had blurred together at some point, but the plan had always been clear. Inside were copies, records, small pieces of truth that did not look like much on their own, but together they formed something bigger, something that connected names, dates, transactions, patterns that no one else had bothered to notice because no one else had been looking in the right direction. I placed the envelope on the desk, slid it into my bag, and turned on the laptop, the screen lighting up with a soft glow that reflected in the window behind me, a ghost version of myself staring back, calm, steady, almost unrecognizable from the girl who had once believed staying invisible would be enough. It was never enough, not in a world like his. Not when power rewrote the rules and silence became permission. My fingers moved across the keyboard, logging into a system I was not supposed to have access to, pulling up files I was not supposed to see, but access had never been the problem. Attention was, and no one paid attention to someone like me, not until it was too late. I checked the time, 9:43 p.m., 26 minutes since he gave the order, which meant I still had a window, small but real, and I intended to use every second of it. Somewhere across the city, Adrian was probably already focused on something else, another deal, another decision, another life he could shift with a single sentence. And that was exactly why he had missed it, why he had missed me, because he did not look twice at things that did not demand his attention. I shut the laptop, slipped it into my bag, and paused with my hand resting on the zipper. One last moment before everything moved forward, irreversible, unstoppable, and I realized then that I was not afraid of what he might take from me. I was only waiting for the moment he would realize what he almost destroyed, because when that moment came, it would not be fear he felt. It would be something far more dangerous, something he could not control, and by then, I would already be gone. I left the building at 10:02 p.m. with everything I needed packed into a single bag that did not look important enough to stop anyone, and that was the point, because the most valuable things are never the ones that draw attention, they are the ones that pass unnoticed, carried by people no one thinks to question. The streets had thinned out by then, the late-night rush settling into a slower rhythm, headlights stretching into long lines of white and red, the city breathing in a quieter, steadier way. And for the first time since he gave the order, I allowed myself to feel something close to clarity, not relief, not safety, just direction. I turned west this time, changing my route without hesitation, because routines keep you safe until they do not, and tonight I needed to disappear between the spaces of expectation, to move in ways that could not be predicted by someone who believed control meant certainty. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a single vibration, nothing more. But it was enough to confirm what I already knew. The process had started, the ripple effect of his decision moving outward through people who followed instructions without asking why. And I wondered, briefly, how many of them believed they were doing something necessary, something justified, when in reality they were just part of a machine that did not pause long enough to understand what it was erasing. I kept walking, counting blocks without looking like I was counting, passing storefronts already dark, reflections of myself flickering in the glass, always the same expression, always the same controlled pace. Because panic changes everything and I could not afford to change anything yet. The bus stop at the corner of 8th and Madison was nearly empty, just one man scrolling through his phone, another staring down the street like he was waiting for something that might never come, and I stepped into that space like I belonged there, like I was just another person heading home after a long day, invisible again in the way that had once protected me, the way that had allowed me to see things others missed. The bus arrived 3 minutes later, right on schedule. The doors folding open with a soft mechanical sigh, and I climbed aboard, dropping exact change into the fare box, because details matter, because consistency keeps suspicion away, and I chose a seat halfway down, not too close to the front, not too far in the back, just another calculated position in a night built entirely on calculations. As the bus pulled away, I looked out the window, watching the city slide past in pieces. Familiar places turning into distance, distance turning into something that could not be traced, and I knew that somewhere behind me, the version of my life that had existed just hours ago was already being rewritten, removed, adjusted to fit a narrative that did not include me. But there was one thing he had not accounted for, one variable he had never considered, and that was the fact that I had never been part of his system to begin with, not really, not in the way he understood control. Because everything I had done, every file I had touched, every pattern I had followed, it all led to something outside his reach, something he did not even know he needed. The bus turned onto a quieter street, the kind lined with small buildings and dim lights, and I pressed my hand lightly against the bag resting on my lap, feeling the outline of the envelope inside, the weight of it steady, real, more powerful than it looked, and for a brief second, I closed my eyes, not to rest, not to escape, but to remember why I started this in the first place, because it was never about him, never about his world or his decisions. It was about something he could not buy, could not command. Something that existed long before he ever noticed me. When I opened my eyes again, the bus was slowing, approaching my stop, and I stood without hesitation, moving toward the door with the same calm I had carried all night, because the truth was, I was not running from him, not yet. I was simply moving ahead of the moment when he would finally understand what I had been doing in secret, and by the time that understanding reached him, I would already be somewhere he could not undo. I stepped off the bus at 10:31 p.m. into a part of the city that did not care who you were or who you belonged to, a place where streetlights flickered instead of shined and no one looked twice at a stranger moving with purpose, and that was exactly why I chose it, because power does not travel well in places that refuse to recognize it. The air felt different here, cooler, quieter, like the city had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. And I walked 2 blocks south before turning into an alley that most people would avoid without thinking, but avoidance creates patterns and patterns create visibility, so I moved toward it instead, blending into the kind of space that disappears from memory the moment you leave it. The door I reached looked like nothing, just chipped paint and a broken handle, but it opened easily under my hand, revealing a narrow stairwell that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old wood. And I climbed without hesitation, each step measured, each sound controlled, because silence is not the absence of noise, it is the discipline of not making any. The second-floor hallway was empty, the overhead light humming softly as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it, and I walked to the end, counting the doors without looking at the numbers, because I already knew which one was mine. Inside, the room was small but clean, a single bed, a table, a window that faced another building close enough to block most of the view, and for a moment I stood still again, not out of fear but out of habit, listening for anything that did not belong, any shift in the quiet that might mean I was no longer alone. But there was nothing, just the steady hum of electricity and the distant echo of traffic far below. I set my bag on the table and unzipped it slowly, pulling out the envelope first, placing it in the center like it mattered, because it did, more than anything else I carried, more than anything he thought he controlled. My phone buzzed again, longer this time, and I took it out without rushing, checking the screen, reading the single line that confirmed what I had expected. The network was adjusting, access points closing, names disappearing from systems that once recognized them. And somewhere in that quiet shift, mine was being erased too. But erasure only works if there is nothing left to trace, and I had made sure that was not the case. I moved to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to see the street below, watching as a black car passed slowly, then another, not stopping, not searching, just moving through, and I let the fabric fall back into place, because it was too early for them to know where to look, too early for him to realize that I was not where I was supposed to be. Back at the table, I opened the envelope, sliding out the contents one by one, spreading them across the surface in a pattern only I understood, each piece connected to the next in ways that did not seem obvious unless you knew where to start, and I had spent months learning where to start, learning what to notice, learning how to follow something without being seen following it. The clock on the wall read 10:48 p.m., and I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds to breathe, to let the tension settle into something steady, something usable, because what came next required precision, not fear. I reached into my bag again, pulling out a small flash drive, nothing remarkable about it, the kind you could buy for less than $20. But inside it held everything he had missed, everything he had overlooked because it did not fit into his version of control, and I turned it over once in my hand before connecting it to the laptop, the screen lighting up as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The files loaded slowly, deliberately. Lines of data forming a map that only became clear when you stopped looking at it like information and started seeing it like intention, and I leaned closer, eyes scanning, confirming, aligning each piece with what I already knew, because this was not about discovery anymore, it was about timing. Somewhere across the city, Adrian Volkov believed the situation was handled, that the problem had been addressed, that the quiet girl behind the desk no longer existed in any way that mattered, and for now, that belief was exactly what I needed, because the moment he started asking the right questions, the moment he realized there was something missing, something he could not account for, that would be the moment everything shifted, and I needed to be ready before that happened, because once he understood what I had been doing in secret, he would not try to erase me again, he would try to find me. I did not look at the time again after 10:48 p.m. because time had already stopped meaning what it used to. It was no longer about minutes passing but about how long it would take before he noticed the absence, before the silence I left behind started to echo in places he controlled. The laptop screen cast a soft glow across the table, turning paper into shadows and shadows into something sharper, something more defined. And I followed the lines of data with steady eyes, not searching anymore. Just confirming, because everything I needed had already been found long before tonight. Names appeared where they should not have, connections formed where no one had bothered to look, small inconsistencies that did not matter individually but together created a pattern too precise to ignore, and that pattern pointed to something bigger than him, bigger than the system he believed he ruled, something operating just outside his line of sight. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of it settle, not as fear but as understanding, because this was never about exposing him, never about challenging his power directly. It was about protecting something he did not even realize was under threat, something he had overlooked because it did not belong to his world of control and transactions. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before moving again, opening a secure channel that I had built piece by piece over months, layers of access hidden beneath. Ordinary routines, invisible pathways created through repetition and patience, the kind of work that requires you to exist without being seen, to move without leaving a trace, and I had learned how to do both. The files transferred slowly, deliberately, each percentage point marking a step that could not be undone, and I watched it without blinking, not because I was nervous, but because this was the point where everything shifted from preparation to action, from possibility to consequence. Outside, a car passed again, slower this time, and I turned my head just enough to hear it fade into the distance, the sound stretching out and disappearing like a question that had not been asked yet, and I knew it would not stay that way for long, because questions always come, especially for men like Adrian Volkov, men who notice when something does not fit, even if they do not understand why at first. The transfer reached 50%, then 60, then 70, and I allowed myself a single breath that felt different from the ones before it, not lighter, not easier, just more certain, because once this was complete, the truth would exist somewhere he could not erase, somewhere beyond his reach, and that was the only kind of protection that mattered. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, and in that second I saw the reason I had started all of this, not a face, not a memory, but a promise, quiet and unbreakable, the kind that does not fade even when everything else does. And when I opened them again, the screen read 98%, I waited, still, until it reached 100, until the final confirmation appeared, until there was nothing left to send, nothing left to secure, and then I removed the flash drive with the same calm I had carried all night, placing it back into my bag like it was just another object, just another detail that did not matter, but it did matter, more than anything, because now the secret was no longer mine alone, now it existed beyond me, beyond him, beyond anything he could control. And that was the moment everything changed, even if he did not know it yet. I shut the laptop, the room falling back into quiet as the light disappeared, and for a brief second, the darkness felt complete, like a pause between two decisions, one already made, one still waiting. Somewhere across the city, Adrian was still moving through his world with certainty, still believing that every outcome could be shaped, every variable accounted for. And I wondered how long that belief would last once he realized there was something missing, something he could not track, something he could not replace. I stood, slipping the bag over my shoulder, and walked to the door without hesitation, because staying was no longer part of the plan, not after this, not after the point of no return had already been crossed. As my hand rested on the handle, I paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because I understood something he did not, something he would only learn when it was too late to go back, and that was this: I had never been hiding from him. I had been moving ahead of him the entire time. The hallway felt different when I stepped out, not louder, not brighter, just aware in a way that made the air press closer to my skin, and I knew before I even reached the stairwell that something had shifted. Not in the room I had left behind but somewhere far beyond it, somewhere that did not belong to me but was about to. I moved down the stairs without rushing, one hand lightly brushing the railing, each step placed with the same precision I had used all night. Because even now, especially now, control mattered more than speed, and I needed to stay exactly what I had always been in their eyes, unnoticed, unimportant, easily forgotten, outside, the street had not changed, same dim lights, same quiet corners, same sense of being overlooked by a city that never stopped moving, and I stepped into it without hesitation, blending into the rhythm like I had done 1,000 times before. But this time there was a difference, subtle but real, like the moment before a storm when the air shifts just enough for you to feel it without understanding why. My phone vibrated again, sharper this time, not a confirmation, not a routine signal, something else. Something that carried urgency instead of expectation, and I slowed my pace just enough to check it without drawing attention, the screen lighting up with a message that did not belong to the system I had been watching, did not follow the patterns I had mapped out over months. It was short, just one line, but it was enough to tell me that somewhere across the city, Adrian Volkov had started asking questions. I stopped walking for half a second, just long enough for the meaning to settle, because this was earlier than I had calculated, earlier than it should have been, and that meant he had seen something I had not planned for, noticed something that slipped through the edges of my design, and men like him did not ignore inconsistencies, they followed them. I resumed walking immediately, same pace, same direction, but my mind adjusted, recalculating routes, timelines, outcomes, because the window I thought I had was closing faster than expected, and once it closed, everything would change. I turned onto a busier street this time, letting the presence of people work in my favor, voices overlapping, footsteps blending together, the kind of environment where one person disappears into many, and I moved through it with quiet certainty, not looking back, not hesitating, because hesitation creates memory and memory creates recognition. Another message appeared before I reached the corner, this one longer, coded in a way only I would understand, confirming what I already suspected. Access points were being reopened, systems rechecked, names pulled back into visibility, and mine, the one that should have been gone by now, had been flagged. That was the moment I knew for sure he was not letting it go, not this time, not me. I crossed the street without breaking stride, the signal changing from red to white as I stepped onto the curb, and I felt it then, not fear, not panic, something sharper, something closer to inevitability, because this was always going to happen, sooner or later, the moment when he would stop seeing me as a problem to remove and start seeing me as something else, something worth understanding. I reached into my bag, fingers brushing against the envelope, the flash drive, the quiet weight of everything I had protected, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before, something that shifted the entire balance of what was coming next. This was no longer about staying ahead of him, it was about what would happen when he caught up, when he finally understood what I had been doing in secret, and more importantly, why. The streetlight above me flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow across the sidewalk, and I paused beneath it for just a second, looking up. Without really seeing it, because somewhere across the city, Adrian Volkov was doing the same thing in his own way, stopping, recalculating, realizing that something he thought was finished had only just begun, and the next move would not be mine alone anymore. I did not change direction after that moment under the streetlight, because sudden movement would have meant reaction, and reaction would have confirmed everything he was starting to suspect, so I kept walking, same pace, same posture, letting the city carry me forward while my mind shifted into something sharper, something more precise than anything I had needed before. The noise around me blurred into a steady hum, car engines, distant voices, the rhythm of footsteps on concrete, all of it blending together into a kind of cover that I used without thinking, because blending in had never been a choice, it had always been survival. Another vibration came through my phone, then another, faster now, no longer spaced out, no longer controlled, and I did not need to look to understand what that meant. The system was no longer moving quietly, it was reacting, adjusting, searching, and that only happened when someone at the top stopped accepting incomplete answers. Adrian had reached that point. I turned onto a narrower street, not hidden but less crowded, the kind of place where people passed through instead of staying, and I allowed myself a brief glance at the reflection in a dark window, not to check how I looked, but to see if I was still invisible, and for a second I almost believed I was, until I noticed the car behind me slow just enough to break pattern. It did not stop, did not signal, did not do anything obvious, but it lingered a fraction too long, and that was enough. I kept moving, not faster, not slower, just forward, because if they were watching, they were not sure yet, and uncertainty was the only advantage I had left. My hand tightened slightly around the strap of my bag, feeling the weight inside, not heavy in pounds but in consequence, and I realized something that settled deeper than fear, deeper than urgency, something that felt like inevitability taking shape. This was no longer about staying ahead, it was about being found at the right moment. The next corner came up and I crossed without hesitation, the signal blinking white as I stepped off the curb, the car behind me continuing straight this time, but I did not relax, because it did not need to follow me to confirm anything, it only needed to report what it saw. I reached the entrance of a small coffee shop that stayed open late, the kind of place with soft lighting and quiet music that made people feel safe enough to stop paying attention, and I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me with a muted chime that sounded almost too calm for everything that was happening outside. The warmth hit me first, then the smell of coffee and something sweet, and I moved toward the counter like I had done it 100 times before, ordering something simple, something ordinary, because normal behavior is the best disguise, and I needed to remain normal for just a little longer. I chose a seat near the window, not directly visible but close enough to watch the street, and I placed my bag on the floor beside me, one hand resting lightly on it, not protective, just present. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, it was hard to tell, and then I saw it, not the car from before, not the same movement, but something else, something more deliberate, a figure stepping out onto the sidewalk across the street, not looking around, not searching, just standing there like he already knew where to look, even from this distance, even through the glass and the reflection of lights. I felt it, the shift. The moment everything I had calculated collided with something I had not fully accounted for. Adrian Volkov did not follow patterns when something mattered, he broke them. I lowered my gaze to the table, fingers wrapping around the cup in front of me, steady, controlled, but inside something changed, not fear, not panic, something quieter, something sharper, because this was the moment I had been moving toward without admitting it, the moment when he would stop treating me like a mistake and start seeing me as something else entirely. I did not look back up right away, because I did not need to. I already knew he was not searching anymore. He had found me, and the next move would decide everything. I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds before I looked up, not because I needed time to think, but because timing mattered more than anything now, and when my eyes finally lifted, they found him exactly where I knew they would, standing across the street as if the distance between us meant nothing, as if every step I had taken tonight had already led here. Adrian Volkov did not move immediately, did not rush the moment, and that told me more than anything else could have, because men who act quickly are still reacting, but men who wait have already decided. The glass between us reflected the lights inside the cafe, soft, warm, almost peaceful, but his presence cut through all of it, sharp and undeniable, like a line drawn through something that could not be undone. I held his gaze for a second, maybe 2, just long enough to confirm what I already understood. He was not here to erase me anymore. Something had changed. I looked back down at my cup, lifting it slightly, letting the motion stay steady, controlled, because the worst thing I could do now was show that I felt the shift too, that I understood what this meant, and inside, beneath the calm surface I had carried all night, something settled into place with quiet certainty. The door opened behind me with a soft chime, the sound folding into the low music and quiet conversations around us, but I did not turn. I did not need to, because I could feel it, the shift in the room, the subtle pause in movement, the way presence changes space without a single word. His footsteps were measured, unhurried, each one placed with intention. And I focused on the small details in front of me instead, the faint steam rising from my drink, the reflection of my hand against the surface of the table, the way everything ordinary suddenly felt like it existed on the edge of something irreversible. He stopped across from me, not too close, not too far, just enough distance to make it clear this was not a confrontation, not yet, and when I finally looked up again, there was no anger in his expression, no cold dismissal, just something sharper, something more dangerous in its own way. "Attention, you were not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low, controlled, but different from before, not dismissive, not final. And I met his gaze without hesitation, because this was the moment everything depended on, not what I said, but how I stood in front of him. "I am exactly where I need to be," I answered, my voice steady, not challenging, not defensive, just true. And for the first time since he had spoken my fate into existence, I saw it, not doubt, not uncertainty, but calculation shifting in a direction he had not expected. His eyes moved briefly, not away from me, but through me, as if aligning pieces that had not made sense until now, and I knew then that he had seen something, something small, something subtle, but enough to break the certainty he had started with. "You disappeared," he said after a moment, and the words were not an accusation. They were a statement, an observation that carried weight because it was incomplete, because it was missing the part he had not yet uncovered. I let a second pass before responding, not to delay, but to let the silence do its work, because silence forces people like him to listen, really listen. And then I said the one thing that mattered. I did not disappear, you just started looking too late. Something shifted again in his expression, subtle but real, and in that moment I understood that this was no longer about control or removal or even suspicion. This was about understanding, and that made it more dangerous than anything that had come before. The cafe around us continued as if nothing had changed. Cups clinking, quiet voices blending together, but none of it reached us anymore, because the space between us had become something else entirely, something that held every choice we were about to make. He leaned slightly forward, not threatening, not aggressive, just closer, enough to lower his voice without needing to, and when he spoke again, it was different, quieter, more precise. What did you do? And for the first time that night, I allowed myself the smallest pause, not out of fear, but because this was the question everything had been leading to. The moment where truth would stop being hidden and start becoming something he could not ignore. I held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and I realized then that the power in this moment did not belong to him anymore, not completely, not the way it had before, because he was no longer the only one who understood the stakes. I did not answer right away, because the answer was not just words, it was everything I had built, everything I had protected, everything he was only beginning to see, and when I finally spoke, it was quiet, controlled, but it carried more weight than anything I had said before. I protected something you did not even know you were losing, and the moment the words left my mouth, I saw it, not confusion, not anger, something deeper, something that told me he was already starting to understand, and that understanding would change everything. He did not respond immediately, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because men like Adrian Volkov do not pause unless something forces them to reconsider the ground beneath their feet, and I had just done exactly that. His gaze stayed on mine, steady, calculating, but no longer dismissive, no longer certain, and for the first time since this began, I saw the shift completely, the moment where control meets something it cannot immediately define. You are saying you protected me, he said finally, his voice low, precise, each word placed carefully as if testing its weight, and I shook my head once, small, controlled, because even now, clarity mattered more than anything else. Not you, I said, just as quietly. I protected what stands behind you. Something in his expression tightened, not anger, not disbelief, something closer to recognition, because he understood what that meant, not fully yet, but enough to know this was not about a single decision or a single person. It was about something larger, something connected to everything he believed he controlled. The cafe around us faded further into the background, the soft hum of voices and movement becoming distant, irrelevant, because the space between us had narrowed into something that held only truth and consequence, and neither of us could step away from it now. His eyes moved slightly, not away from me, but through the idea of what I had said, aligning pieces, testing possibilities, and I could almost see the moment it clicked, the moment he realized that the inconsistencies he had noticed, the small gaps, the things that did not fit, they all led back to me, not as a threat, but as a missing link. Why did you not tell me? He asked. And this time there was something different beneath the control, something quieter, something that did not belong to power, and I held his gaze as I answered, because this was the truth he needed to hear, because you would not have listened. The words settled between us without force, without challenge, just fact, and for a second, something in his posture shifted, subtle but real, as if the certainty he carried had been adjusted by something he could not ignore. I reached down, lifting my bag slightly onto my lap, not as a defensive move, but as a signal, because this conversation was no longer about explaining what had already been done, it was about what came next, and he followed the movement with his eyes, not suspicious, not cautious, just attentive in a way that made the air feel sharper. It is already out there, I said, my voice steady, controlled. The truth exists somewhere, you cannot erase it now, and this time I saw it clearly, the moment the full weight of what I had done reached him, not through fear, not through threat, but through understanding, because control only matters if it can still change the outcome, and I had taken that away. He leaned back slightly, just enough to create space, not distance, but perspective, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there before, not power, not command, something closer to respect. What do you want? And for a moment, I almost smiled, not because I had won, not because anything was over, but because this was the question that changed everything, the question that only comes when someone realizes they are no longer the only one deciding. I looked at him, really looked this time, not as a force, not as a threat, but as a man who had just discovered a part of his world he did not understand, and I answered with the same calm I had carried from the beginning. Nothing from you, I said, just do not destroy what you did not build. The word stayed in the air between us, quiet, final in a